Good morning, everyone. It is 8:30 and the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee is called to order. First on our agenda, we will have our hearing continuation over our budgets that we started on Tuesday. And we did get through the Kansas Guardianship program is the one that we're working, so we already did the veterans. So with us virtually on Proponent, or no, I guess it's not actually Proponent, but Dayton Lemunion, Fiscal Analyst, KLRD, and I hope I didn't mess up your last name too bad. So, and you feel free to correct me on how to pronounce that.
No, Mr. Chair, you got it in one, so perfect.
Thank you.
I'll be presenting on the Kansas Guardianship Program, and you should have that document in front of you. We're joined by Gene Cron, who's available on WebEx, and I'll begin whenever you're ready. All right, let's turn to page 4, which begins the current year analysis. For fiscal year 2022, the agency estimates revised expenditures of $1.4 million, all SGF. This is the same as the agency's fiscal year 2022 approved amount. The agency requests 10 FTE positions, which is the same as the approved amount. And the agency has no net change, although you will see in number 2, there are some internal shifts. There are decreased expenditures on salaries and benefits, and this is due to a long-term employee retiring and being replaced with a new employee. And that is offset by increased expenditures on travel as that resumes following the pandemic. And the governor does concur with this request. So I'll now pause for any 2022 questions, or I can move on. Move on to page 6. That is the budget year analysis for fiscal year 2023. For fiscal year 2023, the agency requests $1.4 million, all SGF. This is the same as the fiscal year 2022 revised estimate. The agency again requests 10 FTE positions, which is the same as the fiscal year 2022 revised estimate. And there are no changes to the fiscal year 2023 approved amount. And the governor does concur with this request. I'll now stand for questions.
Committee, do we have any questions for Dayton? Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dayton, could you go back to page 5, please?
Sure.
Could you just talk a little bit more about, due to an increased amount budgeted for volunteer stipends, so what those are, and increased travel, because, and the reason I ask about the travel is yesterday, when the Department of Revenue, we were going through their packet as well in Tax and Assessment Committee. It was interesting because, again, increase in travel following COVID pandemic. And language was a little different for the Department of Revenue, but it was treating it as if it was past and we no longer had issues. So the question is, when did the travel begin? Because we are now like 2/3, almost 3/4 of the way through fiscal year 21-22. So,
Mr. Chair, Senator Baumgartner, the question about when travel resumed, I'll direct to the agency because she'll know more about the specifics of that.
okay.
As for the volunteer stipend, so there was an increase that was passed, I believe, and I'm sure she's screaming in her head what it was, but I believe it was an increase from $35 to $45 per month. And I know she has a presentation where she'll discuss the stipend, and she'll note, I'm sure, that many volunteers actually don't take the stipend. It's more sort of a nominal thing for gas and other small expenditures that they use to assist their wards.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Senator Stephan.
Thank you. We have the 10 FTEs. Are those positions all filled?
I only know the approved amount. I don't know how many of those 10 positions are filled, but I'm sure Gene does know.
Dayton, I do not see any further questions from any members of the committee. Thank you very much.
And I believe Gene has submitted written testimony that she'll present from. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee. Next, we have Jean Carlin, Executive Director for the Kansas Guardianship Program. Jean is with us virtually. She was with us in person Tuesday, but we ran out of time. So, Jean, thank you for taking the time today to testify virtually. And welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Hildebrand, members of the committee. We appreciate this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about our program. And in the course of, I made notes here based on the questions, and I will attempt to weave in responses to those questions as I walk through my information. Basically, I'm going to walk through the annual report that our agency provides to the legislature. So we are an organization. We are a quasi-public instrumentality that was established in 1995. We have a board of directors, 6 of whom are appointed by the governor and 1 by the chief justice. The program, what we do is we recruit and train individuals who are willing to be court-appointed guardians and conservators for adults who have no family and essentially have no finances. They would be all dependent upon public assistance. So while many people and many of the guardianships are family members who are appointed, there are some for whom family is not appropriate or willing to do that. And it's in those situations that we may become involved. What does a guardian or a conservator do? Basically, they are the advocate. They are the voice for the person to help them ensure that they can access services and supports. That might include residential day support, possibly long-term care, providing consents, informed consent for decisions for medical care. And they have an accountability to the court. They're required to annually tell the court how the person is doing and what their involvement has been with the person. If they are the conservator and they handle funds, they're required to tell the court what has occurred with the financial status. When we ask people to take on this responsibility, it is significant. For those of you who would be familiar with the court-appointed special advocates, there's some parallels or analogies there because they are both court appointments. This model is a collaboration with Adult Protective Services with the Department for Children and Families, and then we also work with the state hospitals, and social workers there may make referrals for individuals. So it's sort of a 3-part process. One is a referral may be made to our agency. Our task would be to identify the potential guardian nominee, and then it goes back to the court for the court to make that appointment. So DCF and KDAD's legal provide the petitioning support to take these cases to the court. Once the guardianship has been established, the guardianship program continues to be involved. We provide ongoing support and assistance in a guardianship. I think we all understand that everyone's lives is complex, tied into different services and supports, and we are part of that navigation piece. We offer the availability of a volunteer stipend to help offset out-of-pocket expenses that are incurred. Senator Baumgartner, that's the piece we invite or have to. The volunteers submit to us a monthly report on how they are doing with the person, and then when that report is received, those funds can be released. As noted, some people choose not to take the stipend. Interestingly enough, if you receive more than $600 in funds that we are required by IRS to submit 1099s, volunteers in this situation are seen as independent contractors. The volunteer stipend was increased from 30 to 40 about 2 years ago, 2 budget cycles ago. So that's a big piece of our agency budget as part of flow-through funds. On the report, that if you're looking at it, I'm actually on about page 4. You can sort of see the age breakdown there. About 50%, 57% of the people we serve are under 60. In moving through on page 5, in fiscal year 2012, our agency served just under 1,400 different individuals, and we have a volunteer bank of about 770 individuals. That's kind of a fluid as people come on and some people retire. You can see there that we do both guardianships and conservatorships. Those numbers reflect the majority of the cases now are guardian only. One of the things that we are quite pleased with is that the agency's website was significantly upgraded, which brought us into compliance with accessibility regulations and improved our accessibility for people being able to submit forms online. For example, that monthly report that I was talking with you about can be submitted through our website and makes that a very efficient process. On page 6, you can see that the types of situations that a person may experience in their life, the type of disabling condition. You can also see that in the terms of the type of residence, where do people live? If you combine the own home number and the CR, which is community residential, about 73% of the people we work with live in the community. And I think that's a significant transition over the years from more of the institutional living. In terms of the people that we serve, on page 7, we try to give you just a little bit of people story. These are the individuals that we work with. And this was a story about a young man who had a pretty horrific home situation. And while the school could help, monies at home were redirected to purchasing street drugs and folks coming into his home. And it was a real struggle for him. And ultimately, there was a report for abuse, neglect, exploitation, and a guardianship was identified. And this is the story of the relationship that the guardian established with him to help him gain and increase his independence. The last page, there was a question from the senator relative to the 10 FTEs. We are fully staffed and have been fully staffed. So those positions, we do our very best not to keep them open. We have 7 field staff who cover the state to do the recruiting, the training, and the ongoing support and assistance. So as you can tell, you know the size of the state, some of those regions get pretty large. Relative to the question Senator Baumgart was asking about travel and when did it start, during COVID, we really worked remotely and was very nominal travel. That travel for us includes going into the communities. That's part of speaking to groups, engaging, doing our recruiting outreach, but also attending court hearings and also being a part of the problem solving if there's an issue that arises. And we invite meetings to sit down and continuing education on what guardians can do and cannot do. If we're trying to problem solve a particularly difficult situation, travel can occur related to those. So during COVID, obviously, much of that was dialed back. There were no new funds added. It was how we placed funds in line items. And so travel is continuing to increase as we feel individuals are safe in doing that. It's an individual choice. We don't force staff to travel if that's not their personal preference at that point in time. So we are hopeful that there's a part of much of what we can do, as obviously we're doing here virtually, but there's just some things that being in person and present is significantly advantageous. One of the things, if you want to look at budgetarily, you can see on page or in your documents, I'm looking at a much simpler version. Basically, the contractual services for the most part is where those stipend funds come through. If you take a look at the number of people we served in 2021 fiscal year, and you took the aggregate numbers, our cost per day is about $2.58 per person. And that's realized because of this significant volunteer commitment. These are people in your community, your neighbors who have been willing to step forward. And the agency is standing with the governor's recommendation. There are no changes that we're asking for at this point. Mr. Chairman, that brings me to the end of my comments.
Jean, thank you for your testimony. Committee, do we have any questions for Jean? Senator Petty.
Hello? So Jean, we'll try this again. We're on mic number 3 here. Thanks for being here, and this is Senator Pat Petty, and I think this is an example, the guardianship program, of how, as you mentioned, most of the clients that you're working with are in their homes or in the community and not in nursing homes. So when we look at $2 a day and the assistance that it helps with them, it's pretty invaluable. So thank you.
Committee, I do not see any further questions for Jean. Jean, thank you very much. So with that, we are going to move on to final recommendations for the budgets. What is the will of the committee? Senator Petty.
I'm going to recommend that we, for the Kansas Guardianship Program, that we accept the governor's, or we concur with the governor's recommendations for years 22 and 23 of the Kansas Guardianship Program.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor from Senator Petty to recommend the agreeing with the governor's 2022 and 2023 proposed budget for the Kansas Guardianship Program. Do we have a second? A second by Senator Thompson. Do we have any discussion on this motion before we take it to a vote? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. That is adopted. What about the veterans budget? Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we pass out the veterans budget as proposed in the presentation favorably for passage. With that, I would like to express a special thank you to retired Brigadier General William Turner, because he has, I believe, done a wonderful job of spelling out and providing us with additional information. I appreciate that he is very new to the position, but what I truly think came through, not only in his testimony, but one, he was very forthright with us, and two, his dedication, concern, and compassion for our veterans and their families absolutely rings true like a brand new bell. And I welcome him to his new form of public service, and I thank him for answering our questions so diligently.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor by Senator Baumgartner and a second by Senator Gossage to approve the, or recommend approval of the budget as recommended by the governor for fiscal year 22 and 23. Senator Petty, you have a comment? All right. Do we have any further discussion? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would echo the comments of Senator Baumgartner. My only concern is the 62% increase from 22 to 23 and the shifting into the state general fund and the concerns that over time, you know, these federal funds can't be used to replace state general funds, and we're going to have to really watch that carefully going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Stephan.
Thank you. Yeah, from looking at my notes from the other day, of the 373 FTEs, in running the numbers, it looks to me like towards 130 of those are unfilled jobs. And I certainly don't support carrying that sort of volume forward within the budget.
Senator Stephan, I do believe that was a concern Senator Baumgartner had when in the hearing, and I think she might have received an answer from the retired Brigadier General. So, Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I shared those concerns, and I voiced those concerns at our original hearing. I think the one thing that we need to consider is we've heard in social media, we've heard in the evening news, the morning news, anytime news coverage on COVID. This particular budget is an example that the pandemic isn't over. So even though revenues, budget processes, we're increasing travel because the pandemic's over, even though the Guardianship program says we're resuming transportation expenditures because the pandemic is over. The pandemic isn't over, and those vacant positions right now are the result of what's happening with the shortage of healthcare providers. So it's not as if they're completely empty, but instead the funds are being expended just like all of our hospital systems where they're hiring people from placement services and the traveling healthcare providers. So I understand, one, now why we had those vacancies. And I think it's also important, the sheet that you received that's at your desk indicates the number of positions. The positions are there, but they're not funded. So I do feel that as we move forward, and perhaps things do settle down with regard to the pandemic and healthcare workers, I see that is the goal of the Veterans Administration. So I do share that concern, but I see that for the first time in a long time in some of these hearings, we have an agency that's saying this is our plan, and our plan is to work out of this.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you. And I understand 100%. And I'm a veteran, and if I'm going to give leeway to anybody in this room, it's veterans. I mean, these guys have sacrificed, and I don't think we do enough to help and support them. So I'm just trying to balance the concerns about a budget, but if there's anybody I'm willing to give that leeway to, it's certainly the veterans, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, not seeing any further comments from any members of the committee. Retired Brigadier General, I also echo the same sentiments that were mentioned by my colleagues. And without any further discussion, all those in favor of passing out the Kansas Commission on Veterans Affairs Office budget for fiscal year 22-23 with the governor's recommendation, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. And I want to thank Minority Leader Senator Petty, because she will be the one presenting these budgets on behalf of our committee to the Ways and Means. So thank you, Senator Petty, for doing that. And without further ado, we're going to move on to our open up our hearing on Senate Bill 168. And to give us a bill explanation, Jenna Moyer with the Revisor's Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, members of the committee. Senate Bill 168 provides updates relating to the Board of Pharmacy and the K-Trex program, which is the prescription monitoring program in the state of Kansas. Section 1 is definitions, which I will refer back to in the relevant sections of the bill. Section 2 is about information required to be submitted by the dispenser. And on page 3 of this bill, it eliminates the waiver to submit information to K-Trex on paper. So it would now be mandatory to submit information to the prescription drug monitoring program. I'll just probably refer to it as program for the rest of the bill brief. You'd have to do that electronically. And it would also give the option to add features in K-Trex to optionally report a date or fact of death, the dispensation administration of emergency opioid antagonists, things like Narcan, and data related to an overdose death. Section 3 relates to charges and fees. It would allow the board, in consultation with the advisory committee, to set up an annual it would allow the board to have an annual and set up maintenance fee that would for the integration of K-Trex data into electronic health records. This would not be an additional fee for prescribers and people using the data every day, but if the board deemed it necessary, that they could adopt a fee for integration of the K-Trex data into electronic health data records. Section 4 is related to confidentiality. Generally, all the K-Trex data has to be kept confidential, with a few exceptions, and this would add an exception to allow the data to go to persons operating a pharmacist impaired provider program. It would allow delegates of pharmacists and providers to temporarily access data. This would be things like nurses, EMTs, paramedics, or pharmacist technicians, as well as death investigators who are delegates of a coroner or someone performing an autopsy. It would allow an exception for IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board researchers, if they have contained patient consent, as well as an exception to that confidentiality requirement for Kansas Overdose Fatality Board review. And this would also allow, if there were data that was found to be problematic, just coming up as during the general review, it would, if the patient did not have a recent prescriber as a point of contact, it would allow that information to be reported to KDADS so that they could offer that person treatment confidentially, but it would not be allowed to be released for any other purpose. And this bill would also give a provision that if access to program data were a violation of the law, that the advisory committee could choose to report that problematic behavior to a regulatory agency or a professional licensing body if the dispensing of the scheduled drugs was of concern, and they can make a report about that. So if there's a problematic prescribing of drugs, that the board could report that problematic dispensing of drugs to the licensing board. Section 5 is Amends KSA 65-1687 related to record maintenance. There's currently a requirement that all program data has to be kept for 5 years, and this would eliminate the mandatory destruction of records at 5 years. So the current law says after 5 years you have to destroy everything, and this would allow that data to be kept if it is still required. And subsection B would amend the program data. It's currently required to be stored in the program database. This would allow some exceptions. One of those is for temporary storage to deliver program data to electronic health records, records that are specific to administrative or criminal proceedings, data for research and educational purposes. If the personally identifiable information is removed, things like patient names, and it would allow that data to also be stored somewhere else, to be retained by the board, information to operate the program and enforce the program, as well as the Uniform Controlled Substances Act. And the last section, section 6, relates to the advisory committee membership. There's a lot of just portions of this bill that says, you know, the advisory committee can do this, can do that, and this would add 1 member of that committee, so it would now be 10 members instead of 9, and it would add 1 advanced practice provider nominated by either the Board of Nursing or the State Board of Healing Arts. And this would go into effect upon its publication in the Kansas Register. And I will note that this is a bill from last year, so if we were to work this bill, it would need a technical amendments to update years. And with that, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Committee, do we have questions? Senator Gossage.
Yes, so can you give us just a little background as to when the K-Trex was created?
I'm really hopeful that there's someone in the audience who
Okay.
can do a better job with the history of the program.
Okay, that's all right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will wait for the conferee.
Senator Petty.
This is a clue. I should stop talking. Jenna, I was noticing on page 5, about the reporting. It's line 39, letter E. So this is a new addition for these, then, the Boards of Healing Art, the Boards of Nursing, the Kansas Dental Board, and the Board of Examiners of Optometry. They have to then notify this board in a period of time if there's any licensing practices that have been denied or been revoked. And,
Yes.
and would those would be licensed providers within those fields? I mean, the
I'm
Board
gonna
of Healing
answer-
Arts would be, okay, sorry.
Okay, I'll answer to the best of my understanding of your question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill would add a provision that the Board of Healing Arts, Board of Nursing, Dental Board, and then the Optometry Board would have to notify the Pharmacy Board in writing if there were any action that would disqualify one of those practitioners from being authorized to receive program data. So if your license is suspended, then you would, there'd be certain provisions in which you would no longer be allowed to receive program data. It would not be related to just if you were under investigation unless there were terms upon that investigation that you were no longer allowed to participate in the program.
And just out of curiosity, is this similar to what already is in place dealing with, say, the Board of Healing Arts? Do these same groups provide that information right now to the Board of Healing Arts, or does would this group in turn provide that information to the Board of Nursing, to the Dental Board, or is this just a one-way path here of?
That is a great question, and I will look into that and get back to you because I'm not aware of the current practice of the boards related to reporting this data to the Board of Pharmacy.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Jenna, I do not see any further questions for you. So committee, we will now, and thank you for that, and we will now turn our attention to proponent testimony. With us in person is Alexandra Blasi, Executive Director, Secretary of the Kansas Board of Pharmacy. Alexandra, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Alexandra Blasi. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Kansas State Board of Pharmacy, and I want to thank the chairman and the committee sincerely for the opportunity to have a hearing on this bill. The board recognizes how very busy your committee is both last year and this year, and these are some very important updates that we have identified in conjunction with our advisory committee and the K-Trex stakeholder groups that represent prescribers and pharmacists in advancing and improving the program as things have changed since the beginning of the program. I hope that in your packet somewhere you do have a copy of the K-Trex annual report. There is a very brief history in there, and I'm happy to provide a little bit of background, but there's some really wonderful information in there about the enhancements and improvements to the program and the success that we've had over the last few years in encouraging prescribers and pharmacists to utilize the system since it is not mandatory in the state of Kansas. It's a resource and tool that's entirely voluntary. So the board, of course, submits supportive testimony for Senate Bill 168. K-Trex is guided by the K-Trex Advisory Committee and then housed within the Board of Pharmacy. Its goals are to aim at helping healthcare providers prioritize patient safety, promoting community health, preventing the misuse, abuse, and diversion of controlled substances and drugs of concern, and then preserving, of course, legitimate access to these important substances for legitimate medical use. In 2008, the program was created by statute and was fully operational by 2010. So we've had just about 12 years of program operation to look back on. It monitors Schedule 2 through 4 controlled substances, and those are reported every day by pharmacies for all of the patients in Kansas that receive those prescriptions on an outpatient basis. That information is then collected, and login credentials are provided to prescribers and pharmacists to be able to use that information as a resource and tool in guiding their clinical practice and the information that they can use to inform their clinical decision-making and aiding that patient. Other individuals do have access to the program, like medical examiners that are in course of investigation. And we do provide aggregate data to a variety of organizations in order for them to do research and education. In 2012, the advisory committee was authorized to review and analyze data for purposes of identifying patterns and activity of concern and make notifications as they see fit. They are a group of prescribers and pharmacists to those organizations if they believe that there's a need for a regulatory investigation based on prescribing or dispensing practices. In some instances, the committee is also enabled to provide a referral to law enforcement if there is a concerning patient that is demonstrating doctor shopping-like behavior. I, of course, want to emphasize that these are just referrals, and the advisory committee nor the Board of Pharmacy takes any action on these individuals and just refers that information on to the appropriate regulatory investigative body. Over the past several years, the board and K-Trex Advisory Committee have identified several necessary updates, since the bulk of the law remains unchanged since its adoption in 2008, and only additions were made in 2012. Amendments align with the K-Trex mission and goals, and they have been vetted with the various stakeholder organizations that represent pharmacies and pharmacists and prescribers. These goals include increasing K-Trex utilization and ease of use, protecting patient information and data security, which is of utmost importance given the nature of the data contained in the system, and providing more accurate and timely patient information to K-Trex users, and then enhancing opportunities for clinical intervention. Jenna did a really outstanding job highlighting the different changes. I'm going to reserve the funding aspect for the very end of my testimony, but there were several things that I did want to highlight in terms of some of the changes. Regarding delegates, prescribers and pharmacists have a long-standing history of delegating appropriate functions to their supportive healthcare staff, including nurses, EMTs, and pharmacy technicians. And allowing delegate access is something done in all of the states and is properly constrained by our vendor that provides the K-Trex program to the state of Kansas. This is something that we believe is beneficial and allows prescribers and pharmacists the time to do their other clinical work and allowing their delegates to pull the information from the K-Trex system. In addition, we would like to eliminate the waiver for pharmacies to submit paper records to the K-Trex program. While this may not seem like a good idea, I can assure you that no paper records have been received by the board in more than 5 years, and so we don't anticipate any change to pharmacies. I think this provision was originally implemented with the legislation because at the time, this technology was all very new. Pharmacies have come a long way in the last 12 years, 14 years since the original legislation, and this provision is just simply no longer needed. In addition, we would like to allow the board would like to allow for the collection of certain information that would be new to the K-Trex program and is not currently collected. One such item includes the date or fact of death of a patient. While K-Trex is traditionally used for clinical decision-making for living patients, there are instances in which individuals will pretend to be a patient or pretend to fill a prescription for a patient that is actually deceased. By incorporating data from the Office of Vital Statistics, which the state of Kansas has federal grant funds to be able to enable, we would be able to bring in the date or fact of death into the K-Trex record, thereby making it very clear to any prescribers or pharmacists that are querying the system that a prescription would not be appropriate and dispensing that prescription would not be appropriate because the patient is deceased. This puts real-time and effective information into the hands of those clinicians. Additionally, we would like to expand the access to K-Trex for the following individuals or organizations. This information was specifically requested over the last few years by these groups and is supported by the advisory committee. Unfortunately, we're not able to provide it because it falls outside of the permissive disclosures under the Act. Kansas impaired provider programs are reserved for prescribers and pharmacists who are suffering some sort of substance abuse or of a recovery program. And those programs would like to be able to access K-Trex data to ensure that prescriptions and appropriate treatment programs are underway for those individuals. It would be limited, of course, only to the time that the individual is enrolled in the program. Practitioners and pharmacists also conduct research on a regular basis that is reviewed by an institutional review board and approved. However, we are not able to provide them with patient data even if the patient consents to that allowance because of the way that the statutes are currently written. If the patient consents, the board believes and the K-Trex advisory believe that they should have the ability to authorize a prescriber that is doing a research or investigational study to access their program data in an appropriate fashion. Additionally, the state has recently started an overdose fatality review board to review certain cases in a confidential manner. The board believes that it would be appropriate to release such confidential information to that body. And then a medical care facility's aggregate de-identified data for their own research purposes. Regarding the notification requirements that Senator Petty asked about, it would be a one-way street. The idea here is that while the board does often become aware of prescribers that have, obviously we're aware of pharmacists that have disciplinary action because we as the Board of Pharmacy take that action. However, there are instances where we may not learn that a particular prescriber's license has been revoked. And that revoked licensee should not have access to the K-Trex data. It is not permitted under law. But if we don't learn of that information swiftly, then we cannot turn off that account, that user account, and take the appropriate action to prevent them from having access to the data. We are hoping that in the long run, we can automate these notification processes from the boards. Most of the time, they do notify us now anyway. They take the initiative to do that, but we would just like to put it in writing and make sure that we have a standard by which we could then go ahead and automate that process for receiving that information from those boards. The only time we would be returning information to the board is if the advisory committee believed a referral was appropriate for a particular individual as previously discussed. But mostly we want to protect this information. And so in order to do so, it's very important that we have current up-to-date information about the K-Trex users so that we can make sure that only those that are appropriately authorized have a user account and can access the data. Additionally, the board believes and has worked with the advisory committee on an area where we do not seem to have many options. The advisory committee often reviews patients that demonstrate a history of substance abuse or have concerning prescribing patterns. They are moving from doctor to doctor, from pharmacy to pharmacy to receive controlled substance medications. In many instances, a referral to law enforcement is not appropriate based on the prescriber's interpretation of the data, but that is the only avenue that the advisory committee has. The advisory committee would very much like to have the opportunity to refer that patient to the Department on Aging and Disability Services so that that department could do an appropriate outreach to provide them an offer of clinical services if they chose to take advantage of that. Of course, it is paramount that that information stops there and is not disseminated to any other state agency that information could potentially be used against the individual. So this is just an opportunity for clinical intervention. There are two recommendations that are not in the actual bill itself, and I would like to highlight those. Since last year, we've learned a couple of data points that we need to be collecting, and were not included in the original bill. I've already reached out to the reviser for these two brief amendments. One is that there's increasing confusion about the date the prescription was filled versus the date the prescription was sold. We actually need to be collecting both data points because the date of fill for the pharmacy could be actually many days before the patient picks up the prescription at the pharmacy and it is dispensed. So we need to collect both data points. The other item is that changes in veterinary prescribing have shifted the location where some animal owners receive prescriptions for their animals. While veterinary prescribing dispensing is exempt from K-Trex, and the board continues to support that exemption, veterinary prescriptions dispensed in Kansas pharmacies are reported to K-Trex under a human owner's name. To distinguish the human owner's prescriptions from the animal prescriptions, adding a species code to the required submission of information from the pharmacy would be helpful in distinguishing between those two prescriptions. Pharmacies already have the capability of doing this, and many states already require it. The board has also been in discussion with the Medicaid program and understands an amendment to the bill is needed to address new requirements for Medicaid providers under the Federal Support Act. The board supports the friendly amendment and will continue to work with the Kansas Medicaid program. Lastly, funding. The board is fully aware that new funding mechanisms are not a favorite of the Kansas legislature, nor are they of the boards. However, the legislature tasked the board several years ago with coming up with a comprehensive funding plan for K-Trex, which does not involve state general funding and would survive the loss of federal grant funds, which are currently used to support a significant portion of the program. The board has established a long-term funding plan and has worked with our budget committees to support those and move them forward long-term. The only remaining item not yet funded is the integration of the K-Trex data into electronic health record systems. This is entirely optional. The K-Trex system will continue to remain free of charge for all users that would like login credentials. However, the federal grant funds are expected to end in August of 2023. While we will continue to pursue grant funding opportunities and hope that they will be there for the state of Kansas to continue this integration free of charge to Kansas pharmacies and health systems, we need to prepare for the possibility that grant funds may not be there. And so the board has proposed a fee-for-service option for this integration service. And if the entity wanted to take advantage of that integration, they would participate in the fee-for-service plan. Again, I want to emphasize that the K-Trex base program, where you have a separate login and credentials, would still remain free of charge and accessible to all of our Kansas prescribers and pharmacists. This would just be sort of an enhancement, which many are taking advantage of. As you can see by the graph, the number of integrated searches has climbed dramatically over the last several years, while web searches on our main K-Trex platform remain fairly steady. The board is very sensitive to the financial impact this may have on K-Trex users, but was tasked with providing a plan for the event of ended grant funding and believes the value of the integration program outweighs the cost for integrated facilities. However, if the legislature disagrees or this committee, the grant funding and the grant funding should come to an end. K-Trex will continue to operate without integration and still provide necessary patient information to prescribers and pharmacists using our main K-Trex platform. That would never go away. The board would hope that any financial concerns could be discussed and addressed and would hope that they may not impact any other necessary updates to the act. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Alexandra, thank you very much for your testimony. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Alexander, thank you for being here. I'd like to go to page 4 of the funding that you were just referring to. And what I see here is that you're saying the pharmacy fee fund is, so the pharmacy fee fund, is that a fee on the prescriptions, or is that a fee that will be assessed this year for pharmacists that want to participate?
No, it would be a fee actually on the facilities that integrate the data. So that would be the health system or the national pharmacy chain. It could impact pharmacies. We would not anticipate enacting this fee until grant funding ran out. So as I said, August of 2023, we're projecting to have grant funds at least through that date. We will continue to vigorously pursue grant funds, and we hope that this wouldn't be needed for many years or maybe ever. But we wanted to have a plan proposed.
So the 2022, you're saying that some of these grants will not run out till 2023, but you still proposed that you may have to do this in 2022.
Well, to be perfectly honest, the language added about the date that we had to adopt regulations was something added by the reviser last year. We would be perfectly fine leaving that open-ended so that we would not have to adopt regulations until it was absolutely necessary.
All right. And then on fiscal year 23, then, should you not get these grants, and there are 2 here that you're saying may be eliminated, I noticed that the SAM HSA grant would be available till 2026, which is why you projected that out. But 981,000. Thank you. Could you explain the K-Trex fund of 200,000? Is that directly out of the general fund, or where does that come from?
It is not. We were very fortunate last year as part of our funding plan to receive an allocation from the Kansas Opioid Settlement Funds of $200,000 each year. So that is transferred in at each fiscal year as funds are available in those opioid settlement funds.
Okay, and if I may, Mr. Chair, my last question is you're saying you may start to charge the user, but only if these grants were not available.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Alexandra, would you entertain a amendment that would clarify that this would not go into effect unless?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Petty.
Alexander, thank you for being here. And I think I've heard this funding issue like before.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's not new. But I noticed as I was looking through the report that you have had, or it appears, a pretty sizable increase in the number of participants.
Yes.
And so could you just give a percentage on that?
I don't know that I have a percentage off the top of my, 29% increase just in the last year.
Okay, thank you. That's what I thought. So it's being used widely, and that is the hope of K-Trex in the first place. And I appreciate your explanation of the addition of the person on the board because of the use of prescribing. So I appreciate that. Back to the funding issue. So this would be the fee would be based on their size?
That's correct. We would anticipate that it would be based on the number of users at that location. So if it's a small clinical practice of 2 doctors, then obviously the fee would be very different than for a very large health system, which I will not name.
Okay.
Senator Holscher, and then we'll come back to Senator Gossage, and then we need to move on. So Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was curious about the point, excuse me, you mentioned before, authorizing the advisory committee to make confidential patient referrals to KDADs in the cases when there's a patient that needs clinical intervention. I think you mentioned that currently it's the police department that is notified.
Yes, unfortunately, that is the only referral option for a patient right now is law enforcement.
Okay, so my question is in regard to that, because I noticed then it's not under the recommendation section. Are there other complexities or roadblocks to having that happen? Or is it just that by the statute, it's not allowed?
Yes, I believe there are no other roadblocks. It's just not allowed in statute.
Gotcha, okay, thank you.
Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A follow-up question. On page 13, we see that, this program started in 2008, and I would think that the number one goal would to reduce overdoses from these medications, but yet we've seen them go from, in 2019 to 2020, went up 21%. We don't have 2020 to 21 data. Do you happen to have that?
I do not, but I'd be happy to look at our records and see what I could provide to you after the meeting.
I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Alexandra, thank you for your testimony, and committee, thank you for your questions. I would like to draw your attention to written only, Carol Moreland and Aaron Dunkel. And we do have neutral testimony virtually with Sarah Furtick, State Medicaid Director. Sarah, I'm not going to twist your arm or anything, but we are almost out of time. Would you like to change yours from oral to written?
Mr. Chairman, if that's the committee's preference, I certainly can. I can tell you that my planned oral testimony was extremely brief. So if you wish to proceed, I'm happy to.
If it is extremely brief, go ahead.
It is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, KDHE does not have a position on the bill. However, we would respectfully request a friendly amendment to it that would allow KDHE to comply with the requirements of a federal law called the Support Act that requires Medicaid prescribers to check the K-Trex system before they prescribe a controlled substance to a Medicaid beneficiary. Starting this fall, we will have to start doing some reporting to CMS as to whether or not our prescribers are complying with that law. And we need an exception to KSA 65-1685, I believe, in order to allow the Board of Pharmacy to disclose that information to us. And we described the nature of the friendly amendment we're requesting more thoroughly in our written testimony. We have discussed it with the Board of Pharmacy, and I believe they don't have any concerns with it. So that concludes my testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Sarah, thank you. Questions, committee? Okay, not seeing any. Sarah, have you already reached out to Jenna about that amendment, the wording?
I believe we have reached out with the revisers, Mr. Chairman, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. Committee, we also have neutral written only, Vicky Whitaker, and no opponents. So did we miss anybody that was wanting to testify? Okay, not seeing any, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 168. And just a reminder for tomorrow, we are planning, and I do not have a list of the bills yet. I'm trying to work through to make sure we have all the amendments ready. But we will plan on working bills tomorrow. So if we do have the language to the reviser and the reviser is able to get those out, we'll probably try to work this one tomorrow as well. And so also, we also have approval of minutes for January 11th, 12th, 13th, 18th, 19th, and 20th. So I believe everybody has had an opportunity to review those. Do we have a motion on those minutes? A motion by Senator Gossage to approve the minutes, second by Senator Thompson. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Ayes have it. And our committee is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.